So why did Russia wait so long to hit Ukraine this hard? Like and subscribe.
The real, economic damage that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine is really hard to deny. Now, again, it's amazing how little coverage, in fact, like the difference between one Wildberries distribution center and the port of Odessa, in terms of economic.
Yes, Russia has closed the port of Odessa. And that's, let me give you an idea of how bad the situation is. There are farmers in Ukraine that aren't even bothering harvesting their crops because there's no way to get their crops out of the country. That's how bad the situation is in Ukraine. The port of Odessa is how Ukraine moved all its grain out. It's a breadbasket, one of the biggest exporters of grain. And Russia has completely, 100% shut that down. And there is no alternative. There is nothing that works. A tiny portion can be brought over, maybe to Romania, and exported. But the port here isn't configured to handle grain exports. So the quantity that can be moved that way is minuscule. So there are farmers that are just not harvesting their crops in Ukraine because there's no way to move it. That's how bad it is. And that's just the ports. That's not even talking about all the gas stations Russia's hit and all the industrial centers Russia's hit. Russia has started going harder and harder as when drones are sent deep into Russia. Instead of retaliating against Europe where the drones are coming from, Russia is retaliating harder and harder against Ukraine.
Economic value is just, they're not at all comparable. Let's be honest, right? This is huge. The fact is that the Russians have just shut down, not just Odessa.
To give you an idea why they aren't harvesting the crops is you need to fuel to harvest the crop. It takes work. And they can't, the price the grain is selling for in Ukraine right now, it's not worth the fuel to harvest the grain.
But I think
Nikolaev as well.
Nikolaev.
Plus, in a lot of places, they can't even get the fuel because all gas stations are destroyed.
Anyway, there are a number of smaller ports right there along the coast on both sides of Odessa, and they have all been shut down. And it's just basically a total blockade now. That is huge. That causes huge economic damage and real logistics problems, because I think the truth was that all along a lot of military equipment was going on those ships.
Yes, absolutely.
Even on some of the grain ships. I haven't seen the footage, but I know like Mark Sloboda claims that he's seen footage where, they're actually pulling, whatever vehicles out of the grain. They have them hidden there. I don't know if that's true or not, but it very possibly is true.
I guarantee you it's true, just because moving large supplies in by boat is the cheapest way to do it. Trying to move it, if you have something in the rest of Europe and you want to move it to Ukraine, trying to go through different rail systems. And Ukraine's rail system is different from Europe. It has wider tracks. You can't just send one train all the way from one end to the other. You need to send it, unload it, switch to train systems, load it back in, and it'd be at risk of being hit by Russia as the trains go. Whereas you could just put it on a boat, you just bring it around, bring huge amount of supplies that way. That's why so much of the oil of the world, for example, is moved on tankers.
So this is a huge blow. And, again, I'm sorry, but, all the clouds of smoke and all the leaping flames in the world, doesn't even begin to compare with what the Russians have to the damage that the Russians have inflicted on Ukraine over the same period of time. Again, that just doesn't...
Yeah, they've returned the damage 100-fold.
Get through the thick skulls of a lot of these journalists. It seems a lot of them just watch TV and they limit themselves.
And by the way, the trigger for Russia shutting down the ports was Ukraine hitting like 20 to 100 ships, depending on reports, in the Azov Sea here.
To proper approved sources and continue to, churn out the propaganda. So that some of them are not really even aware, only barely aware. But it seems like, if you're a responsible, intelligent journalist, even if you're a very strong supporter of Ukraine, and you ought to be looking at this very closely. And there's, I think there's some awareness on the edges. People like Yulian Lipke, who is, again, a very, very strong supporter, passionate supporter of Ukraine, but an actual journalist, a realist, and he's saying, things look pretty grim, It's not just the port, it's like all the gas stations have been taken out. And then the strikes on Kiev have been, quite effective. There was that one on the military expo just north of Kiev that, the Ukrainians are claiming that 10, 11 people were killed. There are all kinds of rumors circulating with...
I hear it's much, much higher than that.
In Ukraine, that it was more like 100, and I don't know what it was. But there were a lot of top people, at that, including foreigners, there was at least one Pole who was killed. That death has been acknowledged. Again, contractors, engineers, designers, head of technical institutes, just part of the kind of the Ukrainian and European MICs that were there. And right there in the middle of the day, these missiles came in with deadly accuracy and just blew the place up. And that's just one example. These are real blows. So on the one side, it's not like the Ukrainian strikes have no effect. Obviously, they've had some effect, especially the strikes on the refineries. But it seems like it just seems like everybody's acknowledging that the Russians are making repairs and moving on, and the shortages that have appeared in certain regions have pretty much disappeared all across the country.
True.
With the one exception of Donbass, really. And, even in Crimea, it's the problem has pretty much gone away.
I think a question a lot of us have is that why did Russia wait for so long to take this type of action? Because it's clear it had the capability to inflict this type of damage years ago. From the beginning of the war, it could have. But
yes, it could have. Like shutting down Odessa ports. That Russia obviously could have done that from the beginning. But that would have a huge civilian impact. It would have been politically costly for Russia to do that. It would have been used by Western media as propaganda to vilify Russia. It would seem, look at the suffering Russia's caused. There'd be reporters going to the poor farmers that can't export their grain, and it'd be all over the evening news everywhere. It would be terrible for Russia. But now after all the long-range drone strikes into Russia, they can't really do that anymore because, of course, if Ukraine is doing long-range drone strikes into warehouses, civilian warehouses in Europe, what grounds is there to criticize Russia for doing the same to Ukraine? And if Ukraine hits all these grain barges in the Azov Sea, how can they then complain about the port of Odessa being shut down? It's the same thing. So in each case, Ukraine, the drone strikes by Ukraine have given Russia the political cover to do things that they could have done at the beginning of the war.
But it's only now at this point that we've seen it start to take out gas stations, hit Kiev hard, shut down the ports. Why do you think this was a smart move? What is the rationale behind this?
Yeah, I guess the thinking, that the Russians, I think, really were reluctant to go after the ships. We had.
What changed is all the civilian deaths that Ukraine has been causing, that is making the evening news in Russia. And the Russians are like, end them. Make it stop. Take Ukraine out. Go harder. And so Russia's going harder. To give you the latest example of what Ukraine has done, they attacked a vacation resort. Drone flies down onto the beach where people are lying in the sun and kills 6 people. That's not a military target at all. That's just terrorism on the side of Ukraine. And in the face of that, Russia is getting tougher and tougher and tougher.
We had these grain agreements and so on forth, but it was never honored by the other side. And part of it, like in the case, especially, let's say, of the port of Odessa, there was pressure from their allies, from countries like India, that are in part, not dependent, but are, helped by exports from Odessa and nearby ports, of grains and other agricultural goods or products. And so the Russians listened to. I think it's clear that Putin listens closely to. He wants to maintain good relations, have support from these countries like India and China, in particular.
Yeah, that was the political calculus at the beginning of the war. But when Ukraine hit all these grain barges here and basically prevented the export of grain from here, well, you think Russia is going to allow Ukraine to export its grain when Ukraine has hit Russian grain barges, and destroyed them? No. Eye for an eye.
But over time, especially after the attacks on the Russian vessels in the Sea of Azov, he decided to take his gloves off. Now, it's also been reported that, that the Russians have, I think, actually made a deliberate effort to make up for reduced grain exports from Ukraine by increasing their own grain exports to let's say, vulnerable countries like Egypt. And that has made it easier for them to do it. This is something that Alexander Mercurius points out. It's just that in the past, when Russia seemed to make a move towards shutting down the port of Odessa, there were all kinds of cries of, complaints coming from countries all around the world. And the Russians were sensitive to that. This time, you're just not hearing them. And that tells me, I think, that the Russians probably had been preparing for this. They had been maybe, again, like increasing their supplies, showing that.
And there's also the fact that right before Russia shut down the port of Odessa, Ukraine hit all these grain barges in the Azov Sea. So that's damaging the flow of grains to the same places like Egypt. So Egypt didn't like that at all.
Okay, you're going to be okay. We'll take care of you if you lose this. And so now we're not hearing anything. And, that's one reason that it's happening. It's also, again, is I think direct retaliation for the increased strikes on the ships in the Sea of Azov.
Exactly.
But in the larger picture, when we look at the gas stations in Kiev, all of it together, we do see, it seems to me, an escalation on the Russian side, a kind of a taking off of the gloves. And it's just that, and if you listen
And on the front lines in Ukraine, Russia is moving faster. It's taking heavily fortified positions with relative ease. It's on the verge of capturing the last fortified towns. Reason this is happening? All the gas stations destroyed, all the rail cars destroyed, Odessa blockaded, all damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. The Ukrainian military, its logistics is shutting down. They're not getting men to where they need to be. And so the Russians are just steamrolling them.
to the rhetoric of, Putin in particular, it seems like a decision has been made that, okay, we just have to win this on the battlefield. We were hoping for a settlement. Maybe Putin was the only one, but he was hoping for some settlement and felt like, that it was more likely a settlement would be more likely if he just trod lightly within Ukraine. It's just that if he held back somewhat, maybe that was a bad calculation. But you've seen that from the beginning. Actually, you go all the way back to 2022 again, though it's always characterized now as a.
What changed it is the long-range drone strikes and missile strikes into Russia. If that hadn't happened, I think Russia wouldn't have changed its approach. But the strikes deep into Russia, that completely changed the dynamics politically. He had to go harder.
Full-scale invasion, it wasn't. And the idea, according to people in the Kremlin, is that Putin was thinking is that, okay, I'll go in with a limited force as a signal so the West will understand we're not trying to take over Ukraine, right? And then maybe we can really reach a deal. Of course, that's not how, in the end, it just, rather than seeing this as a signal of goodwill, of good intentions, there's always seen as weakness. And I think that's been true throughout, Trump, sort of like the Iranians before the current war, were always trying to signal, okay, we have good intentions, we're careful, we're going to be restrained in our responses, we're going to keep the door open to diplomacy. And now that door has been shut. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And the one who shut it was Trump. A, when he cooperated with the assassination attempt on Putin last December. B, when Trump was encouraging towards long-range drone strikes into Moscow. He encouraged Ukraine to do it, and he celebrated it when it happened. That was B. Those two things practically ended any hope of a negotiated settlement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also another consequence of Russia striking hard now, after this narrative of that Ukraine has turned the tide, is that it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to get sympathy. And you're seeing that now. They're touting like, look at what we're doing. We're hitting deep inside. Moscow's burning. And now they're getting hit hard and they want to get sympathy. Like, we need help. We need help. It's like, okay, well, yeah, we see what you're doing there. So I think that's a consequence of this as well. And it's going to be difficult because I feel like the Ukrainians, you're oscillating between like, we're winning, we're beating Russia, to we need help immediately, save us. So I don't know how long you can do that for. So.
Just for quick reference, here's Deep State map run by the Ukrainians, basically. So it's a Ukrainian-favored map. Let's just go back to beginning of summer. Do you see that? I'm going to press today. Look at a change. Everywhere, Russia's moving forwards. And the last line of fortified towns is being approached by Russia. Once that happens, Russian advances will be much faster, like 2 or 3 times what they are right now. Especially considering that Ukrainian army is just going to consider to disintegrate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, that's kind of been the the view of the West all along from the beginning. I mean, there's contradictory views. There's one is that Russia is extraordinarily weak, about to collapse. They're barbarians. They're disorganized. They're just a joke. And then on the other hand, it's like, yeah, they're just on the verge of invading all of Europe, and we ought to be terrified and start increasing our military budgets, by many tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. And it just, that's going to continue. We're going to see that. We see that within Ukraine and throughout Europe, and that's just going to be the way it is, I think, until this war finally ends.
Well,
Agreed.
let's see if it can end. I'm just skeptical on how.
So the three biggest supporters of that, the leaders of the UK, Germany, and France, are all on their way out. You have Macron, there's about to be new elections, about to be a non-friendly leader towards the Ukrainian conflict in France. In Britain, you have a new prime minister who is a lot less excited about the whole Ukrainian projects. And Merz in Germany, he is running into huge political problems. So everyone on the Project Ukraine front is, the leaders, the globalists, are running into issues.
How far this will go. It's been over
Yeah.
4 years. And that's the other thing. That's a lot of times Ukraine supporters, they're always saying like, oh, now it's longer than World War I. You said you'd do it in 3 days, which I don't know where that came from, but
Yeah.
it's something that I hear all the time.
Right. Well, I think there was actually some sort of like a CIA analysis that said in 3 weeks.
Or 3
But
weeks,
clearly, yeah. Unfortunately, I think the way that I understand what Putin was doing, and it was very logical, but he was dealing with irrational people. And I think the way that he went into this war really hurt the Russians on many different fronts. First,
Yes,
it's because
agreed.
he went in such a restrained way and made the Russians look weak. That was the interpretation. Not that they're being restrained, but they're actually weak. And they're just a joke. And so that got started. It was, of course, it pre-existed the war, but that really fed into that common attitude in the West. So, there was that. Okay, gosh, there was another point that I was going to make, and now it just slips my mind. But anyway, when it comes back to me, that may be.
That's okay. Well, I wanted to show you a clip. I think maybe this would be a good time to do it. So, Laura Loomer, she's full on the Ukraine train now, and she went to, this was a video she made for Lindsey Graham's funeral.
Anymore. Instead, in honor of Lindsay's commitment to stand with the Ukrainian people and to stand against authoritarianism, we're going to deploy the drone to the front lines so that it can be used to kill Russians. So rest in peace, Senator Lindsey Graham, a defender for freedom and liberty all around the world.
So she said, in honor of Lindsay's commitment and to stand against authoritarianism, we're going to deploy the drone to the front line so that it can be used to kill Russians. So that's her goal, which is like, this is to honor Lindsay. We just want to kill Russians. And hearing that just made me just think like, well, what are these people? What is their goal? Their goal is just to kill the other people, kill Muslims, kill Russians. Like, what is your objective? Like, what are you going for here?
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think in her case, she has a long history of just showing real hatred against certain peoples. And, this is part
It's just warmongering. Yep.
for the course for her. And Lindsey Graham, too. He was gloating in the fact that, yeah, this is a great deal. We get to kill lots of Russians and we don't have to die ourselves in this war. Yeah, if it was just Russian soldiers, yeah, still, gloating in that I find very distasteful. But you can have an argument. Okay, we need to kill Russian soldiers. This is a war, right?
Yeah, but sending a drone into vacationers at a resort in Russia, there's no excuse for that.
You can, you can justify it in those terms. Unfortunately, a lot of those drones are used against civilians, and clearly are. Especially within the former Ukrainian territories, in places like Kherson and Zaporizhia,
Yes.
Lugansk. Lugansk, of course, is where that dormitory was struck. But recently, I believe it was in Zaporizhia and Kherson. It was in the south that Holiday Resort was hit, and well over a dozen people were killed. Some of them children. Dozens were injured. Many of them severely, and it's just obvious, that this was a deliberate attack on civilians. It was just a pure war crime. It was an intentional massacre. And you just see it all the time. And, it happens. These are kind of the exceptional incidents, but there are incidents like that.
This Russian officials say Ukrainian drone attack on a Black Sea beach in Krasnogard region killed 7 people and injured 40 others. So it went up to 7. It was 6 when last I heard about it.
That every day. Again, school buses being hit, schools, marketplaces, places that are just so obviously civilian targets. And again, where there's no military facility.
The problem is the drones being sent by Ukraine, in a lot of cases, the ones that go along the highway, etc., For the first 80% of their battery life, they look for military targets. Then when they're down to 20% battery power, the AI aboard that starts to look for any target of opportunity. A bus with school children on it, smash into it. That's how you have 6 dead Belarus kids that had gone to a soccer match.
In the range, there wasn't any. It just happens daily, and it's happened for years. It's happened for years, going all the way back to 2014. And in fact, if you look back in 2014, okay, who was the guy? One of the people that began these deliberate attacks on Ukrainian civilians was none other than the current defense minister, Drapati. Now I remember his name, Drapati. And back then he was actually, he deliberately targeted civilians with artillery. That's what they were using back then, and it's something that continued, and it's something that's been, really verified even by organizations like the OSCE that went on for years and years and years, and then it has continued, since the launch.
Yeah, for the 8 years after Maidan, the Ukrainian Azov Brigade shelled civilians' areas in Donbass. It was horrible.
The SMO. Now, interesting. You say, it's not an accident. It's part of it's a real hatred and, a clear intentional devaluation of the lives of these people. There are seen to be a kind of less than human, by the ultranationalists within Ukraine. And unfortunately, the ultranationalist label we can extend to Drapati, even though, he's loved by the liberals. As I mentioned, he also has very close ties to the ultranationalists. This is often true of the liberals.
There's a reason Zelensky recently honored Ukrainian Nazi war criminals and named brigades after them, creating a huge row with Poland. It's because that's who is in power in Ukraine.
Western-oriented people, a very important phenomenon to understand within Ukraine. So after becoming defense minister, he came out with a statement. It's just like these people in the East, they're an irresponsible population. They're lazy. And basically, it's just like we need to Ukrainize them. We have to establish that identity. In other words, we got to take the Russianness out of them. And this is part.
Well, that's not the only thing they're thinking. We just need to take the Russians out, period. They want the land, not the people on the land. People on the land, they're shelling them into oblivion. That's what they tried to do 8 years. The goal of the Ukraine war from the Ukraine side is ethnic cleansing of the Donbass.
Part and parcel. This is the ideology of this government, not just a few crazies on the fringes. And you look at that in combination with these.
It's so funny, leftists that are so furious about Israel ethnic cleansing of the Gaza are supporting Ukraine, whose goal is ethnic cleansing.
Constant attacks. You say this is not accidental, or it's not a few bad eggs like local commanders. This is a deliberate policy of just terrorizing, killing these people. They're especially focused on the people within the former territories. I can go way back, before 2014. It was Poroshenko, the president before Zelensky, and he bragged about how he said that we're going to. Ukraine's going to prosper, but in the East, he's talking about the former colonies, that, their children will be hiding in the basements. Well, they were hiding in the basements because you were deliberately targeting them. He knew about it. He crowed about it, and just like Drapati now.
It's so crazy to think that the West, the liberal democracy and diversity and tolerance, acceptance, all these sort of values that we supposedly purported, that we have so quickly in both of these conflicts just dehumanized the other side. That the Palestinians are less than human. The Russians, we call them orcs. I see comments like something people get blown up in a fireball and then they say crispy orcs. Just this language. And
crispy orcs, God.
Do not see that language from the other side. The Russians, the Iranians do not dehumanize their opponents the same way. I
think Iran, before striking targets in the Gulf, it would give clear warnings. Okay, our LNG facility was hit. We are going to hit Qatar's LNG facility in a couple of hours. That gives all civilians in those facilities time to get out. That's why you never heard so far during this Iran war about hundreds of civilian casualties from the civilian targets Iran hit. It's because it gave advance warning ahead of time. And that's not something the U.S. and Israel do. Rather, they wait for the car to be driving on the bridge before blowing it up. That's the American way.
Yeah, you'll find people within those societies that do. There's real anger. But no, it's just never a government. I was just talking about the Minister of Defense, the former president. This is at the very highest levels. You know, this is a deliberate ideology. You'll see, you know, angry soldiers that will say things like that, or individuals within both countries, you know, Iran, America, but which is inevitable in war. Let's just be honest. But yeah, there is a real problem here that precedes the war, and it is this.
In order to take Ukraine from Russia, when you have a country where like 80% of the people speak Russian and have family in Russia, are connected to Russia, believe in the Russian Orthodox Church, how do you take that country and make it part of NATO, make it aligned with the West, make it an anti-Russia weapon? Well, you support ultra-nationalists. You support the Nazi elements that murdered like 100,000 Poles during World War II. Those guys, you support those guys. And you have a Maidan uprising. You put in a government full of those guys. You outlaw all pro-Russian parties. So in elections, you only have anti-Russian at every level of government. Anyone who is seen as sympathetic to Russia loses power, or worse, they just disappear. That is Ukraine for you. That is the current government. When you ban political parties right and left, Ukraine is democracy with the most banned political parties. You do not have a functioning democracy. You have a Western puppet turned into a weapon to use against Russia. And the fuel of this weapon is the Ukrainian people, kidnapped off the streets and sent to the front lines and sent off when the people you see dragged off the streets by recruiters in Ukraine, those people, they desert at the first chance. And to prevent that, Ukrainians give them some very basic training, then give them some cars and say, you go take this position. And if they don't go, they shoot them. So it's advanced at gunpoint. And but there's a lot of casualties from those types of assaults against Russian in the era of drone warfare. That's why you have such catastrophic casualties on the Ukrainian side.
Celebration of ethnic supremacy, you know, taking different forms, but that is what Banderism is. It's all about ethnic supremacy, and that's what Zionism is. And you know, the consequence of that is that, you know, the people that stand in the way of their projects are considered as being less than human.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember Lindsey Graham. This was early on under Biden, where he was interviewed, and they're saying that, you know, so he was talking to Zelensky, and Zelensky saying that, you know, we're going to kill Russians, and Lindsey Graham said the best money we've ever spent. That's the best money America could spend, just to kill Russians. Isn't that great? And these are the people that are in power. And then I think we living in the West, all of us are going to have to be forced to recognize this, and you have to have a decision to make. Either you reject the hate and say that this is wrong. We can't just dehumanize a whole group of people. Like, you know, Trump saying, I see people say we just got to turn Iran into a parking lot, things like this, you know, just these types of comments. It's either you embrace the hate or you have to reject it. I think that's what's going to happen as these conflicts are going to be forced front and center. And I hope that we are good enough people in the West that actually we do believe in some of the values of what sort of liberal democracy was supposed to be about, you know, accepting other cultures and, you know, and just peace. I think most of us don't have hate in our heart. But do you think there's a risk that there will be enough people that will adopt that mindset of Laura Loomer, like, oh, well, the goal isn't peace and prosperity for us. The goal is just to kill Russians. The goal is to kill Muslims. That's the goal, you know?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
But people have that, obviously. People do believe that.
Right. Yeah, no.
Yeah. A lot of radicalization in both Israel and Ukraine.
It's a real battle for hearts and minds. You know, I think you're right. The majority of people are not like Laura Loomer
and Washington.
But she is there in the, you know, walking in the corridors of power. You know, she's there, you know, meeting with Zelensky, and, you know, again, has the support of the president. You know, unfortunately, you know, this is a voice that he hears, and a lot of people in power hear. Now, she's kind of seen as a representative of, you know, very much the right end of the spectrum in this.
At the current rate, Trump is going to be responsible for losing 2 wars. The Ukraine war, which he had a chance to get out of, to stamp down on Zelensky in Europe and say, stop the nonsense, let's get a peace agreement, do the concessions necessary for that. He had a chance to do that, but yeah, that would have required standing up to Europe and Zelensky, and Trump wasn't willing to do that. So he's now on board. He went along with Zelensky's attempt to assassinate Putin. He went along with the long-range drone strikes into Russia, and now Ukraine is his war, and he's going to lose that one. It's going to be over before his presidency end, and he will have lost the Ukraine war. and the Iran war, that loss is going to happen much, much sooner, in the next 2 months.
In this country. But unfortunately, it's not, let's say, a cancer that's just limited to one part of the spectrum. It goes across. It's part of the whole establishment. I mean, I think that's clear.
Yep, there's brought across leadership in the West.
And there's a real danger, just like you see in Ukraine. I think, again, like the ultranationalists, we're a pretty tiny minority and didn't really have much influence, if you go back, let's say, 20 years.
Yeah, but they were fueled and funded from abroad, Western NGOs. And they funded and grew these ultranationalist groups, just like the United States Mossad funded ISIS in Syria, turned this radical Islamist cultist military force into a weapon against Syrian regime. They did the same thing in Ukraine. Took the most radical, inhuman monsters and multiplied them. And that forms the basis of the Zelensky government.
But they were there, and they were very intense and a passionate minority, a well-armed minority, a minority that is willing to sacrifice their lives. And in the case of the
Well-armed. Why are they well-armed? Because of Western weapons supplied to try to take Ukraine from the Russian sphere of influence.
these guys, can eventually have an outside influence, can transform a society. We've seen this happen before in history.
Yes, a small, extremist group can completely take over and basically destroy a country like Ukraine. But to be fair, it's not just those small extremists. You have the CIA, MI6, Western intelligence agencies, hundreds, thousands of people from those agencies in Ukraine propping up the regime, the undemocratic regime, helping stamp out dissent. Yeah, just like, a long time ago with the Shah of Iran, we helped the secret police there oppress the Iranian people so we could just export their Iranian oil for free. That's just an example I'm throwing out there. Yeah, but that's what we want. What we want in Iran is what we have in Ukraine. Our own extremist puppet government that does whatever we want.
It's happening in Ukraine. It's happened in, Zionism was always something that just virtually every Israeli subscribed to, but it's become increasingly virulent over time. And I have to say, in both, again, Ukraine and Israel, it's happened in.
And I think the virulence of Zionism is a sign of the end of the dollar's hegemony. And it's just like a lot of other places, like decline in the power of the U.S. military, the extremism of Zionism in Israel that undermines the whole Israeli project. It's turning the entire world against Israel, including the U.S. population, which is key to Israel's long-term survival. It's making Americans hate Israel. That's why, to some extent, Zionism was restrained in the past, is they knew that we can't let America hate us because that's the end long-term. But there's no long-term thinking in Israel anymore. And so the Zionism is just being indulged in.
In no small part because of unconditional support from the U.S. And now, as you're kind of pointing out, there's a danger that it can come back home. I think we have to be alert, very aware of that danger.
Yeah. It's a weird feeling to kind of recognize that.
The American, let's say, not logistic, infrastructure. There we go. American infrastructure is so vulnerable to forces within. You could have one guy with an AK-47 go to one of the power substations, shoot it from a distance, and you'd have half of America without power. Well, you'd need to actually take out 2 or 3 for it to make that happen. But still, like 2 or 3 guys at strategic locations, AK-47, take out substation, knowing what to shoot at. And we just don't have any defense within the United States. All U.S.'s military power is abroad in bases scattered around the world. Force projection. Our defenses at home, they're very weak. So it's one thing to be afraid of.
That we are ruled by evil, that we are ruled by evil governments, and I'm living in this government. And
one reason there's so little defenses is because a lot of the terrorists, drug cartels, etc., organizations that exist in the world have ties to the CIA. And so they're not worried about them striking United States infrastructure because they're sort of working for the dark part of the CIA. But some group that the CIA doesn't know about decides to do something, could be an absolute disaster.
Under this government, yes. And so it's just, I hope maybe just the more people become aware and we talk about this, we can dispel it, exercise this from our system somehow, and then remove this evil cloud that we're living in. I hope we can do it.
Yeah.
A currency collapse will cleanse the world of all this rot when it eventually happens. My timetable is 5 to 10 years. And this Iran war is an accelerant for that.
No, I do too.
Okay, well, I think we'll end it here, Dad.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this was a great video. It gave me the chance to speak on a whole bunch of subjects, which I like. It's, yeah. Ukraine is a bloody mess, as is this Iran war. They'll eventually sort themselves out. This will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch, and I'll see you next video. Bye.